I'm just testing the microphone. Can you hear me at the back?
Yes.
Am I deafening you at the back? Jolly good. All right. Well, I'd just like to start with a little bit about myself. I've been interested in shipwrecks for many years, a lot of years, and started when I was a scuba diver, and for some of my life I've actually been employed professionally as a shipwreck researcher and earn my living providing research material for people such as authors who didn't want to come to the archives in the UK, museum teams, underwater archaeologists, and also, I have to say, occasionally treasure hunters and salvage. The scope of my talk, because the subject matter of the East India Company ships and mercantile service is so large, this is essentially going to be a gallop through the subject. I couldn't hope to touch on all of the things that have happened in the whole period of the company's mercantile history. I don't pretend to be an expert. There are a lot of people who've done a lot of extraordinarily good work ahead of me. People like Anthony Farrington, whom we all remember, Rowan Hackman of the World Ship Society, and Jean Sutton, who produced Laws of the East. All of these people are extremely, very much in their debt for the ground that they prepared for the work and the interest that I have. And of course the FIBIS, who've been remarkably good at getting everything that they can online. So acknowledgement is due to FIBIS too. You can take notes if you wish, but there will be a short book list at the end in the form of a handout, so you don't need to take detailed notes on the books I refer to. A couple of points of clarification. If you have a query about something that I ask that you don't understand, if I use a phrase or term that you don't understand, please put your hand up and I will explain it. Otherwise, I'd be glad if you keep questions to the end. I think the meeting is supposed to be 15 minutes for questions. So if there are questions that relate to topics that will be of general interest to people, then please do ask at the end of my talk. And of course, I'm going to be around so that you can nobble me at tea if there are specific things about specific ancestors or ships or something that you want to ask me that's of particular interest to you. So, let's make a start. And we're talking about the mercantile service, 1600 to 1834. Called the mercantile service in my heading there because we must remember that the East India Company started its life as a trading company, and that was its raison d'etre. And until 1834, when the mercantile service, the trading ship service, was abolished, the main thrust was to trade the goods. I'm going to run quickly through some of the way that the service is structured, and not dwell on it too much. Ships for the East India Company were mostly chartered. A lot of people are quite surprised about that because the competitors, the Dutch, the French, and so forth, most of them owned their own ships. They built them and they owned them. But the East India Company mainly chartered them from syndicates of owners who were responsible for the build and for the operation of the ship. And the ships fell into sort of several categories, which I normally call roles. They were the regular ships, and they were the big three-deckers that traded out to the east and came back. They were regular in the sense that they ran to a sort of regular timetable, not quite as quick as the number 11 bus, but there was a sort of schedule of out and back. But they were the mainstay of the trading arm. There were certain numbers of these chartered for voyages every year. Occasionally the demands of trade meant that extra ships were needed, and the East India Company was quite plain about it. It called them extra ships, and they were often chartered a bit at the last minute for 1 or 2 voyages. Then there were the licensed ships. We forget in these days of sort of global pluralism that the East India Company had a monopoly of trade for a lot of its operation. So nobody else could go and buy cargoes out there, trade in goods, visit ports and so forth. And the East India Company controlled a lot of the operations out in the subcontinent. But it lost its monopoly in 1813 for trade to India. And so it then started to license other people to operate ships. Sometimes they carried part cargoes for the East India Company itself, but more often they carried their own cargoes, but they were allowed to trade at East India Company operated ports. Then there were the interlopers, not a funny expression that the East India Company used themselves. These were in effect trespassers. They were people who took a chance, decided they would try trading to the east, see if they could nip in and out, get some cargo, come home, make some money without the East India Company noticing. And if they were stopped and arrested or made to desist, they often lost a lot of money, and it was a sort of a civil offence, but quite severe. Some of the other services of the East India Company, you'll probably be familiar with the country service, and that's the network of shipping that operated between ports in Asia and China, well, Asia, Southeast Asia, India, China, all around there. These were the ones that went round assembling cargoes at the big entrepôts, ready for the regular ships or the extra ships to go and pick up the cargoes. And of course, the company did operate a fighting arm called the Bombay, later the Bengal Marine. This was a navy that actually helped to defend the ships, and there was also the pilot service and other government vessels that were employed around the various presidencies. So that's just to put it in context. A cover shot is of Lords of the East, Gene Sutton's excellent book on the East India Company. You can see there some things I've already mentioned. Vessels were on long-term charter, big three-deckers, suitability for cargo. The vessels had to be really durable for voyages to the tropics. The term ship's husbands is a strange term to us, but it was the principal managing owner of the ship owning syndicate. If you see the reference to ship's husbands, it's really the person who's in charge of the often the build and the chartering arrangements and tendering for the ships that were chartered to the company. One of the reasons why people wanted to get business with the East India Company was because you automatically got repeat voyages, and unless your ships were a bit iffy, or they had one of these unfortunate accidents like being wrecked or captured, then you were pretty well set up to continue to charter to the company. Even if you lost your ship, or it did get worn out, there was a doctrine of hereditary bottoms, which always amuses people. And this was that if your ship, for some reason, was no longer serviceable, you had the right to have you could charter to the company a new one, and you got preferential treatment in that. So again, it was pretty much, a lot of jam for people who set up as these ship owners. Okay. How were the voyages organised? There were seasons of sailing. We forget, I think, sometimes that sailing required attention to the weather, and there were seasons. Normally September to February, the ships would assemble in Longreach in the Thames or down at Gravesend, start to take on supplies for their outward voyage, and then they would move off into a naval port like Plymouth or Torbay, Portsmouth, ready to set sail a bit later on in May. They tried to get going by May of each year, because if you didn't, several things happened. First of all, you kind of lost your takeoff slot for the trade winds, because you were relying on getting out there as quickly as reasonable and catching the trade winds, often off the Brazils, they were plural in those days. And also, if you missed the trade winds, you were going to get into some pretty rotten weather, so your chances of coming to grief were increased significantly. Ships were armed. In the early part of the company's history, first 100 years or so, they might be armed with anything from 10 to 50 guns. Towards the latter part, up to late mid-1700s to 1834, they more likely had 36 guns. So they were pretty heavily armed. You didn't want to encounter an East Indiaman that was, angry with you. And also, they were protected by the Royal Navy and travelled often in convoys at key points of their journey. And when they got to the subcontinent, there was some local protection by the Bombay Marine. Who went on ships? Well, it's obvious, really. Just want to say a bit about officers and crew. In terms of what ranks people were, I tend to refer to people as captains in my talk. In terms of the kind of posh, correct word, one should say probably commander. And in fact, the East India Company officers would probably want to be called chief officer, second officer, third officer. But in common with the merchant service, the sort of more even civilian merchant service, I do tend to refer to them as first mate, second mate, third mate, and so forth. East India Company officers and crew were extremely well trained, and in many cases they were actually better fitted out than the training of some of the people in the Royal Navy. Hence there was a lot of problem with getting pressed into Royal Navy service, particularly when you came home. Supercargoes and factors. Supercargoes are people who were in charge of the cargo business, and agents. Factors were the people who ended up in charge of the factories, which were in fact sort of depots in the subcontinent. Writers, civil servants, other civilian passengers, and of course soldiers, lots of them. So we've got this vast operation, and what happened to the ships? Well, they were wrecked on reefs, lost in storms, captured, caught fire, just went missing, and some of them, many of the above. I've analysed, Jean Sutton in her book, Lords of the East, has got a very useful appendix of listing all the ships and the numbers of voyages, and I've actually analysed these and trying to give you a flavour of the number of ships and the size of the enterprise. And you can see, we don't need to go through it in detail, but you can see in the beginning, fewer ships. The first 50 years, 130, then it increases a lot, then it increases even more, 1704 onwards, and finally about 426 ships employed by the company. I have to say this is very rough. I'm finding new ships sort of that were employed all the time, and so it's a sort of work in progress. So we've got a total over the period of operation of 1,236 ships, which as you can imagine is a sort of sizable fleet at the time, and 4,175 voyages. Now, if you think about what a voyage was, you could really actually double that figure. We're probably talking nearer 8 to 10,000, because a voyage was out and back. There was never, except with a few intentions to send ships out to India to stay in India, the idea was you went there and you came back. So the voyages from A to B and back to A again. So it was a massive undertaking. Looking at the scale of the losses, again, I've analysed all these. I just want to explain what my headings are. Wrecked means lost, foundered, wrecked on reefs, in some way or other disappeared below the waves. The India Company had different sort of terminology. It distinguished between ships that it called lost and ships that it called foundered, and it's all to do with the amount of stress of weather and so forth. But wrecked means sank, basically, here. Captured means captured by enemies, French, the Dutch, sometimes even the Portuguese, pirates. And missing. Missing is an interesting category. With all of this shipping that's going about on the seas, we may think that things set off, and of course they didn't have GPS and sat-nav, but there was quite a lot of busyness coming and going, so other ships often knew what had happened to particular ships that ran into trouble. But the ones that we call missing here in this list are ones which sort of set sail on a fair day from a fine port and were never heard of again. The expression that they use is never since heard of. So it's not the same as knowing that you're in a convoy with 6 other ships and one of them gets into trouble and then obviously goes off into the distance and obviously sinks. Those will be in the wrecked category, but the missings are the ones that sort of disappeared into the blue and never heard of again. The other category, or the category marked other, is in fact all of the mishaps and accidents, such as catching fire, exploding, falling apart and so forth. And you'll see that there's an extraordinary number of increase of other categories towards the end of the company's period of operation. And there's a high increase of things that caught fire. And I wonder whether that's to do with the prevalence of cargoes being more flammable or people not taking so much care. So, flag, by the way, is the second of the company's ensign. There's 3 of them, that's the second one, second version. 284 casualties by all causes over that period. And it represents, I should say that casualties, I'm using this in the shipping terms, meaning shipping casualties. There was, of course, massive human casualties and loss of life. That's not what I'm counting there. But it represents 23%, nearly a quarter of the ships. So if you set sail on an East Indiaman, there was, depending on exactly the period that you went, there was nearly a 1 in 4 chance that the ship wasn't going to make it. And if we're talking about people, of course, there were also the issues about whether or not you survived yourself due to sickness, illness, and the general kind of depredations of life at that time. And as I said, it's variable over the time periods. Wars with the Dutch and French, various times made it, more or less dangerous. Surges of pirate activity, particularly off, nothing changes much, particularly off the east coast of Africa, and of course off the Malabar coast, and where there was a pirate called Andrea, who seemed to get angrier by the decade and captured more and more people. And the effect of commercial pressures and private trade. It's worth pointing out that one of the perks of being an East India officer was that you got space on the ship to put your own stuff, to buy your own stuff, and do a sort of bit of wheeling and dealing at the ports that you called at. And there is some indication that the commanders often put into ports that they were not supposed to really, but they wanted to go there because there was something neat they wanted to buy because they thought they could sell it on their own account back home. And so often they, completely against orders of course, would nip into places that were rather more dangerous and try and nip out again, and sometimes didn't quite work. Okay, so where it all took place? Well, it didn't take place at the spot marked A, that's just because I centred the map on the Atlantic. But that's a map of the world, mostly, and as you can see, the losses actually did take place everywhere. At some point, I shall, on my website, which I'm trying to update now I've stopped work, I will be putting plotting some routes and wrecks on, but at the moment it's not there. But this is the sort of stamping ground of all of the activity. It could be anywhere. So early unhappy accidents. First unhappy accident is that they're all supposed to come in at once, but never mind. In 1613, a vessel called the Trades Increase caught fire while careening at Bantam. And for those of you that don't know what careening is, it's when your ship gets somewhere, it needs to have its bottom scraped and all the holes blocked up with tar and pitch. So they empty out the ship of most of the people, they all pile in the small boats called jolly boats and long boats, and they go around and tar brush all the leaky seams. And to do that, they have to keep leaning the ship over. And that one, obviously, somebody was a little bit too avid with the tar, and they had a fire, and it caught fire, and it was lost. A few years later, the Hector went over too far, and didn't even actually catch fire. It just went over and over and over and over, and oops, and just sank. They had a lot of trouble with fire in those days. And then at Surat, the Swallow caught fire, and before anybody could do anything, the ropes that were securing it caught fire, so it was no longer secured in the harbour at Surat, drifted downwind and set light to the Charles. So both vessels totally destroyed. And the thing is that this is a great setback to the company because it's losing, valuable cargo and valuable ships. And the Loyal Hester, bless it, just fell to pieces at a port in the Persian Gulf. This is all worn out. But more seriously, what happened to the people? Well, you can see that some of them drowned at sea. A very high proportion survived the wreck and got ashore, and that's really when the troubles often started. They, as you can see, died ashore waiting for rescue, or they died attempting to get to friendly shores where people were actually not disposed to help them, and in fact often were disposed to kill them. Captured and killed, captured and enslaved, captured and ransomed sometimes. And what I want to talk to you about first, to sort of tell you a story, is a story of a long captivity of Robert Knox. And that image on the left is a book that he wrote as a result of his experiences. No, they're all going to come in at once. Okay. He went out on a ship called the Anne, and he started his voyage in 1658. He went with his father, also called Robert Knox. The commander of the vessel was Captain Robert Knox Sr., and Robert Knox, who wrote the book, is the son. They'd had one successful voyage to the east, so they were now thinking they'd go and look around and get cargoes for the second voyage. They didn't have as much luck. They were stooging around a bit, trying to pick up valuable cargoes, and the agent, the company's agent at Fort St George at Madras, said, well look, go down to Pondicherry, because you might be a bit luckier there might be some stuff ready for you to bring back to England. On the way down to Pondicherry, they got caught, by then it was just turned 1659, got caught in a huge storm, and lots of ships were wrecked that they were in company with. And they were told to put into Kottayar, which is a small port on the eastern side of Ceylon. I'm going to call it Ceylon, of course it's present-day Sri Lanka, and repair their mast because they had been dismasted. And if you're dismasted in a sailing ship, it's like losing your engine, basically. So they put into Kottayar. For some time before this rather desperate current civil war, I lived in Sri Lanka, and I know Kottayar. It's a very nice little protected bay. And they put in there, and they started to make their repairs. They started to trade with the locals. They got bullocks, they got fresh meat, they got fresh water, they were all fine. They should have been a bit careful because the year before, somebody else had got wrecked on the Maldive Islands, the islands quite close to Ceylon, and they had made their way to Ceylon to try and get home, basically. And that was a ship called the Persian Merchant, only the year before. And those people had been captured and enslaved by the king of Kandy in Ceylon, a man called Raja Singha, who was a rather strange ruler in that he got a penchant for keeping European captives in a sort of menagerie. By the end of his reign, he had up to about 500 European captive, but they weren't banged up in jails. What they were distributed among the villages. Each village had to support this European captive and give them fresh food daily, for which the captive didn't have to work. And they just had to live there, but they were not allowed to go away. Very strange. Anyway, so Robert Knox and both of the Knoxes and various sailors were captured and experienced this for some years. Then in 1661, the younger Robert Knox, saddened by the death of his father, decided he ought to think about his future, what he was going to do, and he became an itinerant peddler. He won the trust of everybody and started making these knitted woolen caps, which seemed to go down a treat that with the native population wanted to buy these. And so he had a business, and he went around everywhere, and he sold these, and he looked and he found where he was going to be able to escape to. And in 1679, he made his way out of the Candian kingdom, which is in the centre of Ceylon, and made his way to the Dutch settlement, where he finally escaped. So, 20 years it took him, and then when he got back to the UK, he then went on another 2 or 3 voyages to the east. But he was 20 years away, and if I can just go back to that other slide, he wrote this book on the journey back to England. And it's a very interesting story because he was a sort of, if you like, a sort of David Attenborough of his day. The observations of an historical relation of the land of the island of Ceylon in the East Indies is extremely well written. It's written in a very neutral tone. You might expect that somebody who's been kept prisoner for 20 years might have a few, kind of worries about that. But it's a very good and early account of the customs of the place. And he doesn't seem to have been in any way damaged by his experiences, which is extraordinary. Right, moving on. I'll go through these fairly quickly. All those ships on the left captured, this is sort of size and different sorts of things happening, all captured at the same time by the French off the Irish coast. So, not far from home. A French squadron of 6 line of battleships and 2 fireships, commanded by the Comte de Nesmond, just captured the lot. So, a big loss of finance there. The Samuel, captured off the Cape of Good Hope by a French privateer, Les FIBIS. Not sure about my pronunciation. Privateer, for those of you who don't know, is a sort of, it's a sort of early private finance initiative by the governments when they go to war. What happened was that commercial shipping could apply for something, a document called a letter of marque, M-A-R-Q-U-E, which is French, but it's not only the French that did it, we used to do it as well. And you applied for this document, which allowed you then, even though you were ostensibly a civilian merchant vessel, you could prey on enemy shipping with the blessing of your own government and capture what you could and commandeer it as a prize. So this French privateer captured the Samuel, the East India Company vessel, but the Samuel put up a really good fight, and the French were so impressed that, in view of the gallantry of the crew of the Samuel, the captors ransomed it back to the company for only £200, which was, a snip. And didn't always work the same way. The Mocha frigate made one voyage for the East India Company to Surat under East India Company orders, and then turned pirate itself in 1695 after leaving Bombay. Obviously decided that gone out there, didn't fancy this much, so it was going to see what it could do on its own account. And it went on a piratical cruise for 2 years and surrendered at Madagascar to Commander Warren after a couple of years. And 14 of the pirate crew were then hanged at Woking, down the road here. It's not entirely clear, and I want to do some more work on this, as to whether they all had the idea that they were going to be pirates when they sort of set off, or whether they were in fact boarded by a pirate and then all sort of fell in with it. So, interesting story. More captures, 1691. Satisfaction was captured by the Mocha, not our Mocha, and the Charming Mary, which probably wasn't being very charming at the time. And the vessel was released after Captain Willocks was taken prisoner. And that sort of sounds very resonant of what's happening on the coast of Somalia today. They used him as a pilot because he had extremely good skills of navigation, and they released him. They wanted to get to a few places, and they thought, well, we'll just get the best chap we can, and then we'll release him back when we've got no further need of his services. So that's some sort of amusing little things there. But one of the longer stories of shipwreck and survival that I want to talk to you about is the story of John Dale of the Winterton in 1792. The Winterton was an East Indian, and she was in 1783, and a painting. And the book on the right, Marked for Misfortune, I recommend is a very good read by Jean Hood. It tells the story of the wreck of the ship and of what happened to all of the people on it. So if you're interested in survival stories and kind of clues to how to find out about things like that relating to your people, I recommend that book. John Dale is the chap on the right here, where he looks, and indeed is about 14, although he wasn't 14 when he was third mate of the Winterton, he was a bit older. But we must remind ourselves that what we would call more or less children often were in command of East India Company as indeed naval vessels. And one often sees these pictures of boats, ship's boats with oars where they're rowing away from the ship, and 12 hunky, husky men of 45 years or old, very grizzled, are being commanded by what appears to be a boy of 12, who is the officer. And it's the same in East India. So, John Dale and Winterton. Winterton, outward voyage. This is a story of sort of survival and sort of human courage against the odds. But when I think of this and the other stories, I often think these days when people nowadays are caught up in events, accidents, tsunamis, disasters abroad, on the news you often see these, they're obviously grief-stricken in many cases and bereaved sometimes and shocked, but they're huddled under a blanket in the departure lounge at Madras, at Chennai or something at the airport, and they're saying, well, we've been here for 48 hours and they haven't got us home yet. And you only have to think of what the situation was hundreds of years ago and compare it to how our expectations of sort of, if you like, repatriation after disaster has changed. So, this vessel was wrecked on the island of Madagascar. It's trying to go through the Mozambique Channel, which is the bit of water in between it, which is a wide strip of water. It was wrecked on the 20th of August, 1792. In the course of the wreck, 52 people died and 260 got ashore. There was also 75 chests of silver lost. Most East Indiamen carried money, specie, as it was called, or some valuables of a monetary nature. There were also 10 women passengers, quite interesting. These women, there was one woman who was returning to India to go to meet with her husband, who was a soldier, and taking her daughters. There were also the Bristow girls, a couple of young ladies of about 14 and 13, Mary and Charlotte, I think, who were, they were the result of a liaison between John Bristow, who was an Honourable Company civil servant, and a native woman. But these girls had been sent to England for their education. They'd been, as it were, finished, and were now proper young ladies and were going back to England to join their father and his native wife. So all of those pitched up on shore. John Dale was the senior surviving officer as third officer, and he set off to Mozambique Island, which is on the left there on the coast of Mozambique, to try and get help, leaving the 260, including the 10 women, to set up with tents and whatever they could salvage from the wreck to protect themselves and to feed and get water. So August. By January 1793, so August to January, another 80 had died on shore. He went, this is the route that he took. I know the map is not very big there, but I can explain. So he got to Mozambique, which was Portuguese. He managed to persuade the Portuguese governor to lend him some money to hire a boat to go back to rescue the people. And one thing to remember, of course, if you're ever caught up in a shipwreck as a member of the crew, or commander or officer, your pay stops, your money stops. When your ship's wrecked, no more wages. So a lot of writing of letters and letters of credit and promises to pay, and please can I get a boat because I need to go and rescue my 260 people. So he went back to collect them, and on 1st of April he managed to get them back to Mozambique. And then he has to get from Mozambique, a Portuguese possession, to get them all to India. So then he hires a a Portuguese brig called the Joaquin and left to go to India to take them all back. And by then more had died, so there were some healthy ones, but some very sickly. And then just their luck, out on, just getting out towards, I think it was not far, they were captured by the Winterton, which is another one of these French privateers, because while they'd been away and while they'd been wrecked, war had been declared again between France and Britain. So now another, hello, excuse me, my microphone has gone off. I'm going to shout. If my voice drops low, would some of you at the back just put your hand up and I will speak louder and apologise if I'm deafening those in the front. Okay? Right. Okay. So now we've got English people captured by a French privateer, and Captain Mallet of the Winterton was a little bit shocked to find that, because he thought he was capturing a Portuguese ship, right? And so then he gets the Portuguese ship, and on the Portuguese ship are all these English people who are sort of in various states of decay and dying and sickly and fed up. And so he then has to decide what to do with them. So Captain Mallet, when you capture another vessel as a privateer, you've then got the you've got the choice of deciding what to do, because you've now got 2 ships to command and a limited number of people to do it with. So classically what you do is you put some safe people on the prize, the vessel you've captured, and then you send it to a friendly port, and then you carry on in your own vessel and carry on privateering. So Captain Mallet sent this Portuguese ship with some of the sickly survivors from the wreck of the Winterton to Mauritius. So now a whole bunch of them have been sent to Mauritius, so they're not going anywhere quick. But he took the healthy survivors, including 16 soldiers and John Dale, the third mate, kept them with him aboard the Winterton, because he might encounter other vessels and he wants strong, healthy people to be on his side. So then, off Tooting-Corin, the privateer came across a Dutch East India Company vessel. That's what VOC stands for. I'm not going to pronounce it. And that was their vessel called Ceylon. And so now the privateer itself is now taken by a Dutch ship. I'm not surprised if you find this very complex. I'm sure John Dale just thought, oh no, not again. But we were often mostly in competition with the Dutch. So why I've called that an unlikely ally is because the Dutch in this case did the decent thing and found these English prisoners and decided that they would send them to Madras. So that sounds fine. The Bristow girls and the other women, in fact, I think I'm right in saying that all of the women survived, the hardy species, and got settled back in Madras. But poor old John Dale, senior surviving officer, ship gone, he's in Madras, nearly home, not quite over yet. So he and a fellow sailor book a passage home. He's written another one of these IOUs, drawn on the East India Company, of course, on the EIC vessel Scorpion, which left on the 20th of September. And then nearly home. On the 12th of January 1794, the Scorpion was captured by a French squadron in the English Channel. Dale was transferred as a prisoner of war. This time we're talking a French naval vessel. So he's a prisoner of war onto the French frigate Semirante. Bizarrely, instead of being taken to France, he's now sent across to Norfolk, Virginia in the US, which was operating as a free port for French vessels. And eventually he was freed on parole, well, in the old meaning of the word of an officer. And eventually he got back to England 2 years and 2 months after he left. And when he got back to East India House, they said, "Thank you very much, we recognise very much what you've done. You were responsible for saving a lot of lives in Madagascar and getting people safely, eventually, back to where they should. Here's 200 guineas. And by the way, there's another vessel loading in Gravesend, and we'd like you to command that." For another out Voyage. So, I'm not going to go into this in detail. This is another survival story, this time on the coast of Africa. Very interesting. And about the loss of the Grosvenor. Stephen Taylor has written a new book about what he calls the Caliban Shore, about the fate of the castaways. Lots of interesting things there if you're interested in those. Okay, I'm aware of time. So the companies were concerned to do rescue attempts. I haven't covered the Winterton and other things in detail, but they did send ships for rescue. In fact, in the case of the Winterton, they did equip 2 ships at Madras to go to Madagascar to find the survivors. But by then, they arrived 2 months after they'd finally been evacuated by John Dale. So, again, more cost in letting, trying to rescue the people. Treasure and salvage, whole other sort of situation. Very concerned to salvage any of their goods that were lost. I'm also a member of the Historical Diving Society, and we have lots on stuff being salvaged from East India Company vessels in the old days. And very concerned with the continuity of trade. That's one of their main concerns. So, now, I'm getting a bit thirsty, excuse me. We're all, I think, probably looking forward to our tea. And I expect everybody's got a bit of money in their pocket to pay for this. What the FIBIS have laid on. I'm not sure whether we have to pay for it or not. But I can think that regardless of the money you've all got in your purses and wallets and handbags, I can confidently assert, I think, that I'm the only person here that's actually carrying cash. Because, I'm going to just go through this. This is a record of the Admiral Gardner in 1809. This is a print of something that was produced in great quantity by a publisher called Thomas Tegg, which was a sort of purple prose. I suppose it was the sort of salon news of the world of its time. It produced a lot of these very horrendous sort of graphic illustrations of shipwrecks. And this one's off the Goodwin Sands, the Admiral Gardner, 1809. And the story of this is that the captain, I'm not expecting you to read that, that's shots from my website, and you can read the story there, but the captain is writing to East India House and saying, I'm terribly sorry, I've lost this ship. It was all the pilot's fault because he said we were where we weren't. And the pilot who'd come on board specifically to conduct them across the shallows near the Goodwins had suddenly realised that he needed effectively to put the brakes on, and how you do that with a ship is to reduce all the sails, which means by cutting a lot of ropes that hold the sails up. If you need to do it in emergency, you just cut them. And the pilot cut 2 of his own fingers off, and in that letter there, Captain Eastfield says that the pilot has now lost his fingers and is now delirious and has taken to his bed. So I've had to do it, he's saying. And right at the end, as he says, with a long diatribe about the wind came up from the west and then it came up from the east and we thought we had this much water and then we didn't, and I thought we were, and da-da-da. And then at the end he says, as I am not very well, I trust the Honourable Court will excuse any incorrections in this statement and I remain your obedient servant. And of course, it was a little bit of an apology. One person died, not the pilot, but somebody else, and another vessel called the Britannia, and it was carrying this important cargo of cash. Now, I'm sure you're all aware, cash being I think, Tamil word for coin, and it was the original copper coinage, or one of the original copper coinages, which was used in the subcontinent, 10 and 20 cash. And these are cash coins on the Admiral Gardner. I'm going to hand them around so you can have a look at them. I know how many there are, so... And why this was interesting is because we've got an outward bound vessel here taking coins that have been minted in England, in Birmingham in fact, using this, what I called an early cash machine. This is the first automatic coin pressing machine, and it was invented or put into service by a man called Matthew Bolton at somewhere called the Soho Mint in Birmingham. And because previously, even if you could stamp out coins, they had to be, the copper had to be hand flattened first by somebody before you put it in. He was the one that invented something where they could actually, kind of just get on with the stamping them. And the reason the company needed to send it out was not because there was no copper in the mints at Calcutta, but they couldn't get any kind of regularity or standardisation in the quality of the coinage. So they got it made in Birmingham and shipped it out. Except poor Captain Eastfield, with his incompetent pilot, lost it all on the Goodwin Sands. Now, those are the coins from the Goodwin Sands, and if you look at the edge, you'll see that there are a green patina, or discoloration of the copper with seawater. And that's because they were stored in such a way that they were extremely well packed. And when they were salvaged in, I think it was 1984, well, some of them were, they came up like that. And because I did some work for the team that salvaged them, I get to keep a few. So that's the story of an early cash machine in the East India Company ships. So I think we're about there.
Andrea is now kind enough to answer any questions that people may have.
Or I'll answer them at tea if you've got.
Can I just start off by saying that, funnily enough, at the last meeting we had a talk on the ancestors of Alistair McGowan, whose son, Suetonius McGowan, happened to be aboard the Winterton, actually with his sister. And his sister, unfortunately, was one of the people who perished, but Suetonius McGowan survived and went on to great things, including siring eventually Alistair. People must have some questions on this. Yes?
Yes.
I was interested in the salvage rights with the ships that were captured and then recaptured. Well, what happened in that situation?
Salvage rights, the gentleman was talking. Can you hear at the back? Perhaps not.
Are you talking about the capture of the vessels?
Yeah,
in terms of, well, the vessels were, what the expression was used, they were condemned as a prize, and in many ways it was quite well organised, and they were often, the vessels then ransomed back to the company. I mean, it's Somali pirates all over again. It's, you give us the money, we'll give you your ship back. If you're talking about salvage of stuff that is that was on the ships that were wrecked, that's a different issue, rather more detailed than for now, probably. I mean, I'm happy to talk to you at tea or something.
Yeah, I was trying to catch you at tea.
Who's next? Yes.
Those were all sailing ships.
Yes.
So when did those cease and the steamships come in?
Oh, age of steam. Probably, well, later than 1834. I can't give you the exact date. I'll have you.
You never referred to any of them as schooners.
No, because this was the mercantile fleet, which were not by and large. A schooner is a sort of rig of a ship as well. It's the way that these were full 3-deck sailing ships, and the steamships came later and were much more when the company had lost its monopoly, and there were, the trade to the east was much more opened up, after the border control and so forth took out.
I think, in fact, the first steamship that's claimed to have gone to India was in 1829, which was the Pioneer, I believe, and it was a wood-earning ship. 1829 was about the same time as the railway started.
Yeah.
So to go to India on a steamship was quite an achievement. I'm not sure where they managed to keep going ashore to chop down a few more trees to feed the boys, I'm not sure.
Peter, I think most of the steamships would have started after the Suez Canal was created, which has a problem with coaling, because there has been written about that.
Yeah.
If you go to the Maritime Museum, you'll probably be able to find the answer to your query.
Yes, thank you, Julian. Works at the National Maritime Museum.
I mean, one date I've got is that the Great Britain made its first trip to Australia in 1852, I think it was, or 53. So it had already been rescued, but I mean, it would be about then that some steamships came in. But after all, the clippers The great clippers were much later than that.
Mm. I don't know if anybody, can you hear at the back when somebody at the front asks a question? So maybe if you ask a question, be kind enough to sort of turn and face sideways. If you don't mind. Thank you, John. Next, yes, sir.
In your table, the first period,
Yeah.
ships appear to make only 2 journeys a year, and at the end of the table, they appear to make 4. Were then trips done each year towards the end of the period by each ship?
Yes, I mean you're very astute to spot that. In fact, also in the beginning they didn't make as many voyages as they did. I think about the third period. The first period they were making about 2 or possibly 3 if they were lucky. By about 1774 period onwards, they were making 4s and 5s, and I think this is a tribute to the seaworthiness of the ships, the fact that the system was much more smooth with knowing where to go, knowing what to avoid, and so forth. By the end, a lot of them are making 8s and 9s, and the record holder, I think, is the Scaleby Castle ship, Indiaman, which made 14 voyages out and back, which was extraordinary considering the wear and tear on that ship. So it's going out and back, out and back, out and back, 14 times, so 28 times, for the journey. So yes, you're absolutely right. They did make more.
Design as well.
Yes.
If you read Basil Lovett's book on the Black Hill Frigate,
Yes.
you can find some information in that.
The same ship, presumably, at least a series of ships could be given the same name. So were they actually all the same vessel, or were they successors, you would say?
There were a mixture. There were vessels. The convention normally was that in people that are studying the ships, that if a vessel is in continuous ownership, often they got a new ship on hereditary bottoms, but it would be given the same name because it was built as a replacement. But there were also ships that did have the same name but were owned by different bunches of owners. Yeah.
If May was the optimum time for leaving the UK, what was the optimum time for leaving India to come back to the UK?
Good question. I can't remember. You'll have to drop me a note and I'll tell you. It varied actually depending which side they were and where they were going to come back from, and if they were going to, if they were China vessels coming that were going to India and then on. But I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that. If you buttonhole me and give me a note of your address, I'll find out for you.
Thank you.
I was interested in that chapter, your discussion of the ship which went pirate, who became pirate in 1695. So I believe that the story is that the company was so concerned about pirates at one stage, it searched the English-speaking world at least for a captain who could be trusted to fight the pirates. And they chose a gentleman who was resident at the time, I think, in New York, called Henry Morgan. Well, we all know roughly what happened to him. Yes, Elizabeth.
I'm wondering if your remit covers tea clippers, and whether they were East India Company affiliated or whether they were just privateers.
Probably not privateers in the sense that those were, if you like, licensed pirates. But the tea clippers, sort of yes and no. The expression Indiaman, for a start, was used very widely, or East Indiaman, and often referred to some of these licensed ships, or indeed to ships that were nothing to do with the East India Company, and in fact a lot of them operated out of North America. So the tea clippers came, by and large, tea clippers with a sort of mono cargo, if you like, were probably a little bit later.
And they would be sailing ships? Or
Sailing ships usually, yes, yes indeed.
Even in the age of steam?
Well, there was a terrific overlap. I mean, the
Yes, overlap.
Geraldine or the Maritime Museum buffs will be able to tell you much more. But there's a terrific overlap in that. I mean, the sailing ships, died out eventually because they were superseded by speed and efficiency. Although, of course, wind is free, and as Geraldine says, coal is not. You know, you've got to find coal.
Yeah.
Whereas it's sometimes easier to put up a sail.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any more questions? Yes, sir.
There's one little facet I'd like to add, because I had an ancestor who used to work with these people on their ships, and there was at that time Queen Elizabeth I had sent papers and ciphers and whatever to one of the Mughal emperors in Agra, and that would be 1600. So I can't think of the name of the chap who went, but he, an Englishman who had a lot of experience as an authority in the Middle East. Anyhow, he arrived at the domain of one of the emperors, and I don't know how long he was there for, but so that was 1600. And one of my ancestors was Captain Maxfield, was actually working on one of his ships, and eventually came back to England. But the thing was, just to show you how the English behaved, apparently, when the ship arrived back, or when the ambassador and these people arrived back on the ship they'd left in the creek, which wasn't very far from Bombay. If you look at a picture of the map, it shows you Agra, and it shows you the various places. People on the ship that was left behind went berserk, and a bit like the football hooligans of today, went berserk and attacked this little port just off the coast, and they had to be put down by Indian civilians at the time. So that will tell you something about the yobos of the day.
And your ancestor as well.
The chap came back after chatting with, I'm not sure if it was Aurangzeb or wasn't Akbar. I do know something about these emperors, and eventually he came back, and there were a lot of Europeans there at the time. The English weren't in the majority at all.
No.
As a matter of fact, he was very surprised, and there were a lot of Europeans there, Scandinavian descent, and they were not happy to see the English there, because they said the English were always causing trouble.
That's right, that's right. They were all anxious together. Sorry, would you like to comment on that?
Not really. I mean, I think there was trouble in a lot of ports. You can tell because the voyages were so long, and the crews, like sailors anywhere, they got ashore and they often caused a bit of trouble.
Belvane.
I've got an ancestor whose brother went down on the Golconda. I wondered if you could tell me if there's anything I can find out about.
If you come talk to me afterwards, and if you know the date, do you know the ship?
Oh,
on the Golconda.
Yes,
sorry, I wasn't sure you talking about the place or the.
No.
Right.
I think it went down in the Chinese Sea.
Okay.
Rightly.
I just add one point that.
If Andrea's answered that question, have you?
Yeah, I'll talk to you after May, and we can talk about sources.
Yes. Okay, is it a quick question on the same point?
I'm deaf, so now when these ships came back, a lot of them, I know one of my ancestors who came back, who was the captain, came back to Grimsby. If you look at the map, Grimsby's days, you come back to Grimsby, all the trade would be with his particular trade, not with the port of London. They were ignoring that, but came back to Grimsby, and that's where most of the trade was done at Grimsby, and eventually he got off his ship and became a member of Parliament.
So that's piracy again. In India. But the Dunnington hit a rock, third island of South Africa, and much the same sort of thing happened. But it rather surprises me that if you read the reports, the people that survived, the captain died and his wife died, but the people who survived were the first mate, the second mate, the third mate, the fourth mate. The treasure managed to survive with him, at least part of it. Very interesting subject for a further examination. Yes, Lane.
Where do you actually find the references to this? Is it the British Museum, the British Library, or is it the Greenwich Maritime Museum?
Depends what you're exactly seeking. I mean, it's all over the place, basically.